I really appreciate the water, by the way.
Yes.
In the winter, we'll have coffee or maybe hot chocolate.
Cookies.
Now we might be pushing it. However, maybe I'll make cookies one time and then you
Who's
just will
gonna-
never ask again.
Who's going to take roll?
One of the board members has to do it,
Like a
so
volunteer to take
I'll do
roll.
it.
Okay.
I'll take the notes.
It's the only one I've been able to.
That's ready? Welcome everybody to the Lake Bluff School District 65 Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting for September 10th, 2013. We don't have a secretary, so Leanne, would you please take the roll?
I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
Leanne Charlotte. Present. Julie. Present. Good. Mark Barrett.
Present.
John Rosen.
Present.
Susan Ryder. Present. Thank you. Richard Hank.
Present.
We have a quorum.
No.
And you're gonna run it back up then, right? Thanks.
Okay, so we have a quorum and enough to start the meeting, so we're going to begin with invitation for public comment. If anybody would like to address the board, please do so. Doesn't appear to be anybody here, but if anybody would ever like to come to a board meeting and address the board, we have an opportunity for public comment at the beginning of every meeting and at the end of every meeting. And occasionally, if we can fit it in, we will allow comments during the meetings at our discretion. But we don't have anybody here today, so we're going to move to item number 3, which is the AYP reports, which stands for Adequate Yearly Progress, and Jean is going to take us through that.
Yes, these down. For the audience, and both in the audience tonight and for the website tomorrow, all of the documents we'll be discussing will be posted with the exception of our actual AYP report. These reports will be made public in October. And there is still, as I go through the report, I'll do some explanation. There's still some question as to status on one of our schools. So with that in mind, I made some circles and thought I would just briefly point out a couple handouts here. One of the handouts we've got is actually a report that says frequently asked questions about adequate yearly progress. Does everybody see that one? It says, what is AYP? Thank you, Kate. It stands for Adequate Yearly Progress. Why does it exist? Because as required by the federal No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, each state needed to establish a timeline for adequate yearly progress. So the state, the districts, and the schools must make AYP. Subgroups of students are 45 or more students. And we have listed on the Q&A, this is one of the Q&As, which are on the table. You received them, I emailed them all to you. So
Okay.
I'm just kind of reiterating, and unless you would like the handouts, which we can
No, go ahead.
grab that now.
I just don't want to look for something.
I think a couple major things that are important is, first of all, if you know of people that are in private schools, they do not have these requirements. I think it's important for you to know that way back in 2003, our benchmark started at around 40. It went up 7.5 percentage points every year. For a total of, in 2012, it was 92.5, meaning 92.5% of all students would need to meet or exceed standards. And ultimately, the goal is to have 100% of all students meet or exceed standards in reading and math. And as educators, we all said, we believe in high standards and we believe in high expectations, but there are many reasons why students sometimes do not meet standards. Some of them are second language. A couple years ago, they actually changed the state test. We used to be able to give it in Spanish for some of our younger grades, and they said now you have to give it to the kids in English. That was when I was a principal. It was really tough. We also have kids that have special needs that are sometimes we believe not capable of making AYP. But we have to stop believing that. If they are on an Illinois alternative assessment, for instance, maybe they might be in a handicap class or not be able to communicate, maybe through a technology, then they have to meet standards through a different way, through portfolios. So the thinking is that all kids should meet or exceed standards. As we
2014, right?
by 2014, that was the goal way back when it started. And we knew way back when it started that eventually all schools in the state of Illinois would be failing. We've reached that this year. Not all schools, but I would say an extremely small minority of schools have made AYP this year. I want to remind all of you that, and we did many blasts of information, the state actually raised their cut scores last year. On top of raising their cut scores for meeting and exceeding, they also gave a more challenging and rigorous test. So there were 20% Common Core questions added to the ISATs last year. So not only did the cut scores raise, but also the rigor of the test raised. This year's test is the last official ISAT. It will be 100% aligned to the Common Core. And then the following year, we're going to be moving to PARC, which is the electronic online assessment, assessing Common Core, and hopefully not just a one-time-a-year test, but something that assesses instruction during the course of a year that teachers can actually use to better instruction. So I want to point out again, and there's extra handouts on the table, but for board members, there was a big instruction on how to calculate AYP. There was a big instruction on what does AYP mean. And then in the new packets that I passed out today, there's, and I wouldn't say beautiful flowcharts because they're from the state of Illinois and the federal government, but there's actually flowcharts on the status in Illinois. Do you have your packets?
This is something you emailed to us?
No, she just gave it, right?
No, all I got was this.
You got, okay,
That's
let's,
also up front.
we have those up front, but we'll move forward because really most of these are all things that are aligned in your packets anyway. So, if you take a look at your AYP information, this is where we need to spend the time. And I'd like you, up in the right-hand corner, these pretty little charts that I just passed out. In the right-hand corner, you should have three different ones. One of them says Lake Bluff Elementary School District 65. One of them says Lake Bluff Elementary School. And one of them should say Lake Bluff Middle School. You all have that. Okay, we're going to get started on the district one. So this is the official AYP report. And when you look at this, the first things you look at are the boxes on the top. Is the district making AYP? No. Is it making AYP in reading? No. Is it making AYP in math? No. Has the district been identified for federal improvement status? No. That's a good thing, because when you're identified for federal improvement status, that means number one, we're early into the process. Number two, it also means that there are no official sanctions from a federal level at this point. Now, before we go on, I'm going to give you the good news. There's a little bit of good news in this. Two things of good news. Number one, Kevin is going to be doing a huge presentation in October of the actual scores. So you're going to see the actual scores and an analysis again, and I looked again today because it's reassuring to me. With scores as high as our districts, it's hard to even go up 1 percentage point because we're in the mid-90s, and our scores in both reading and math both went up by 1 percentage point. So that's good. That's under both the old cut scores and the new cut scores. So that's good news. But even if we just went up by the 1 percentage point, we still didn't make AYP. So you need to know that. The other good news is, supposedly, parts of AYP are going to go away. And if you hear of the conversation on the news with something called ESEA, very important, that's the No Child Left Behind laws, and they're looking at changing accountability for states, and really instead of having this you didn't make AYP, you have to offer choice in your district, which we're gonna talk about in a minute. They're gonna have things like you're a 5-star district, a 4-star district, a 3-star district, a 2-star district, or a 1-star. It's gonna be like a hotel system. That's what.
It's
how
like
I
a
equate it.
restaurant.
We're waiting, or like a restaurant. We're waiting for that to happen. Right now, we've been waiting almost a year. And the reason that Illinois specifically has been denied our waiver, is what they're calling it, is because our teacher evaluation system and the implementation of that in our state is a year behind many other states in the United States. So we're being somewhat penalized for that right now. We all were waiting last year, and I remember talking to the board last year, saying we believe AYP will be gone by next year at this time because of this waiver, and we're still waiting. So we still will be having sanctions. I'm going to share with you as we talk about the sanctions. They're meaningless right now because every school in the state of Illinois is going to be working through these also. Questions?
Yeah. Well, I have 2 questions. One is, you said a very small percentage of schools are actually meeting AYP.
Mhm.
Do we know what that percentage is?
We have no idea what the percentage is. I will share with you that Lake County superintendents did a very, very, very informal assessment. And districts that are very high-end socioeconomic like ours, everybody was saying we don't have any schools making AYP. Out of all the Lake County schools, I probably saw 3 or 4 individual schools, not districts, that made AYP.
That made it. And you said that our scores are difficult to raise by 1 point because we're already so high. When I remember looking at the report card online, I remember scores in the 90s. But on here, I see scores in the low 80s.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
We are going to talk about that. What specifically the data that I was looking at today, and you'll see this in Kevin's presentation, I looked at the summary scores for all of our kids for reading and math all combined. All right, and the summary score for our district, I think was somewhere in the 94 or 95, and it had gone up 1 percentage point.
Those are average scores or mean scores or what?
Those are average.
Okay.
So if you look at this particular, this is the district again. This is the only one you're really going to see the 2 of the subgroups on. You'll see in the all subgroup, and I circled it, we did not make it in math. You see where it says met AYP? No. The safe harbor target, which is really, it gives districts an alternative way of making AYP, and it's through looking at your growth and calculating a 95% confidence level. The safe harbor target then was 82.1 instead of that 92.5 that we talked about. Remember the 92.5 that all the districts? If we had made the 82.1 with all of our students, and I know it's confusing, but the bottom line is we did not make it, and so it's 80.4 in math.
But can I just clarify one thing? There's a difference between the average or mean scores that the kids record and what this says, because what this is the percent meeting.
Right.
So those are 2 different numbers. This is if you had 100 kids, there's 82% meeting that. That has nothing to do with their average scores.
This is the percent meeting and exceeding.
Right.
So that means 80.4% of
Right.
our kids are meeting or exceeding standards.
But that kind of answers your question a little bit.
But I think what Leanne's referring to, when I talk about 95, that was under the old system.
Okay.
Under the new system, the scores are significantly, we're in the 80s, because the cut score was really raised. So
Right.
it's going to be a new way of thinking.
And that's going to happen to an even greater extent
Even the next year.
with the park testing.
Exactly.
So all school districts are going to probably see their scores come down quite a bit.
That's a very safe statement.
And by the 80s, again, I need a little clarification. We're talking about the percentage of students that met standard,
Meeting or exceeding.
not the average scores.
Right, that's percentage of students meeting or exceeding. So that means in this case, there's about 20% of our kids did not meet standards, when you think of it in the inverse. When you look down at the bottom,
Just a minute, Gene.
okay,
What, we would have had then 82.1 to meet, is that correct?
To meet AYP this year, yes.
Now, why is it that in the reading, we didn't meet the safe harbor target, but it says yes?
Well, you're looking at two different things. One of them's reading and one of them's math.
Mhm.
So if you look under all, we had an 80.4. The safe harbor was 82.1. We didn't make that. So therefore, no, we did not meet AYP. See that?
I do.
That's why I tried to circle it, because these charts are not the easiest.
Well,
charts.
But in reading-
I understand this
We're
question.
at 80.
In reading it-
84.2 and the.
Oh, you're talking about the-
Under reading, under all,
Yes, that's a question that Kevin and I have seen, and that's gonna lead to one of our big questions that we have to call the state on, because I will also share with you, while it appears tonight on this report that our elementary school did not meet AYP, the site that we look at for our data says it did make AYP. So that's why we share the data and we just keep asking. And the data is actually official data by October 31st. So that's a very good question, and we don't know the answer to that right now. We're working on that.
To me, this doesn't make any sense.
Well, this is what we use from the state to calculate our AYP.
that's why we're trying to get a little granular in it, so people watching will understand what we're really talking about, because it can be very misleading and difficult to understand.
And it's easier, Richard, it's much easier when you actually look at the scores. So we're gonna be getting in the cycle of going through the AYP report, which we're gonna be flying. Under the new system, we'll be flying once we get everything in place. This is a huge transition year across the state for every school and every school district.
I have a question,
So,
sorry.
I still have one more question.
okay,
Is it the percent of kids that meet or exceed that gets you to your AYP?
Yes. yes.
So, and right below there, we're short again at 82.1 versus 82.4, but it says yes.
Yes.
My conclusion, just I'll throw it out there, is that that's within 95%
Percent confidence level.
confidence level.
You are right.
Think back to your statistics classes that you slept
Because
through in college.
It's within the
and-
margin of error.
When you look at that 80.4 to 82.1, we believe it's the 95% confidence level in there, which is why we made it.
Those are
But
But
we've
we have to
seen,
double
considered
check
equivalent.
that.
but we've seen a
Because the
few
95%.
instances since I've been on the board where the state
I was gonna say the same thing.
has basically they post information that appears to be false or inaccurate, but then there's not really a good process to get it corrected either, so.
The one I remember specifically was about cost per student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Educating, there was a glaring error, and it's happened a few times.
I will go back to this, though. We believe very strongly that it's the confidence level, the 95% confidence level, but we want to ensure that that is indeed correct. If you go down to the bottom, and then I'll answer some more questions. Remember it, quiz question. How many students do we need to have to make up a subgroup?
45.
45. So for the district, not for the schools, for the district, we have enough students with disabilities to make a subgroup. We also have enough students to have an economically disadvantaged group. That's our free and reduced students as deemed by the federal government. So when you look at that, again, you look at our reading scores, Safe Harbor was 50.4. Our scores for only students with disabilities was 45.2. So we did not meet AYP there in reading. Same with math. Our Safe Harbor target was 44.4, and our percentage was 39.2, so we did not meet it there. Economically disadvantaged, same thing if you look on there. Safe Harbor was 54 in reading. The percentage that we had was 46.2, so we did not meet. And then the same thing for math. So in essence, on this sheet for district, you can assume that we need to be doing some major work with our economically disadvantaged, our free and reduced kids, and our students with disabilities. Now, as educators and as adults, we all know that students with disabilities learn differently. That doesn't mean we have to have a higher standard or a lower standard for them. That means it's our job as a school district to make sure that the students have the supports in place to meet the standards that are set for them. The same is in mind for economically disadvantaged students. We know from research that students that come from homes of poverty learn very differently. One of the first things I learned as a principal is that I had to take care of their emotional needs going from the bus into the building. Then I had to take care of their feeding needs, because most of them didn't have breakfast. And once we got them calmed down and that was all set, they would learn all day long. So we have to, as a district, start looking at the supports that we need to be putting in place, both with our teaching staff and with our families to service those children. Any other questions, or can we move to the other two and then we'll talk questions?
I have a general question.
Okay?
In Kevin's presentation in October, will the state have published data for all districts in the state by that time? And if so, can we have some comparative data from other districts in the area?
The state will not be, it's not public data until October 31st, so always remember Halloween. So Kevin will do the test score data unless it's been made public. For instance, we're making ours public after the October board meeting.
Because I think it would be really helpful to have some context to know if these numbers, so we don't compare them to AYP for reasons that we've discussed, but maybe it makes sense to see how we did compare to some other districts.
We are in total agreement and we will have some comparisons afterwards.
Awesome.
I think a good answer for me to tell you would, and it's something that we feel very heartedly, is we can't make excuses for it because they're more rigorous standards. That means we have to be teaching differently. And I will tell you that Joanne's been working on that now. This is her 3rd year with the staff. Our Common Core is being implemented. And as we start looking at the elementary school, you're going to notice, especially when you look at the individual school scores, a little bit of an implementation dip in the math at the elementary school. And then we start seeing the math really kind of leveling out and raising and increasing at the middle school because they're a year ahead.
Are we,
So-
I'm sorry. Are we considering, are you considering doing something to help with kids coming to school without having been fed in the morning?
That's something that we haven't noticed as a big problem yet,
Okay,
but it's something that our teachers even have to be trained to look for.
to notice.
Because that's not something that we have, just like we really haven't talked a whole lot or in-serviced our teachers on second language students, we really haven't in-serviced our teachers on what to do with children of poverty. And it really is a huge difference. They learn things very differently. For instance, they might not have the background knowledge that your kids may have from going on family trips or from going to museum. So there's all kinds of things that we have to think about when we talk about children that come from homes of poverty or children with disabilities or even children with second language. So these are, and we're really becoming a district that all districts are really getting more second language students, and with the economy, more children of poverty.
Well, I know we addressed lunch, a year and a half ago or something because we were seeing that kids were coming to school without any food. But I suppose breakfast is a different story because there's no evidence of it unless you go looking for it, right?
And I think to conclude that, I know that at the school where I was principal, we did have to have a breakfast program because we had over 30% of our kids in that school were free and reduced. So, you watch your percentages, you make district decisions. I don't believe that was a federal mandate. I believe it was a district decision to say, hey, let's have a district program in that school because of their, students that don't eat. If you turn to the elementary school page, which is very new to the elementary school, and again, I will remind you, and I'm not a betting person at all, but I would still bet that our elementary school and our middle school will come out on the top in the state, even with the new standards and the new rigor. But in this particular case, it's the first time the school has not made AYP. We made it in reading. We did not make it in math at the elementary school. Another big thing, has the school been identified for school improvement according to AYP specs? No, it has not. When you look on here, again, the safe harbor for all was 88.2. This one again, 86.5. We believe it's the confidence, 95% confidence level, but we want to verify that.
Can I draw attention to that point you made about, and up in the top right corner, has the school been identified for school improvement according to the AYP specification of the federal No Child Left Behind Act? The fact that it says no, that's a good thing.
That's a very good thing.
If for some reason we were having problems and we were identified, what would that involve?
We're going to be talking about that on the next sheet, so that's a great question, Mark.
If there are no subgroups here, what's the difference between all and white?
Well, I'm saying there's no what's the difference between all and white? That's a good question. I think they still disaggregate. You want to answer that one?
So the number of students at the elementary school who are white makes that the only subgroup. All would be all of the students, regardless of their.
So
The scores are different.
What's that?
The scores are different.
They would be different because all would be all of the students in the school. The white subgroup would be
It's
only
just
the
those-
white
There's
students.
not enough
in
kids
that
in the other
building.
subgroups to break it out.
Exactly.
Right. Now, I will share with you is something that we went through a couple years ago, and I think the veteran board members might remember this. We had about 2 or 3 years ago a point where all families had to designate ethnicity for all the children that came to the school district. And I know many parents got very upset by that, but it was a federal mandate. We didn't have any choice with that. So based upon that ethnicity that parents have claimed, that's the difference between the white and our other children. So it's how parents claim their children are. If you turn to the back page, our Lake Bluff Middle School, this is, I believe, the beginning of our 3rd year at the middle school where we have not made AYP in math. So you'll notice on there, Mark, that this school has been identified for some sanctions. And if you look under that, one of the sanctions is choice. And what that means is that we would have to offer our students at the middle school a chance to go to a higher achieving middle school in our district.
In our district.
Think about that. Okay, now, if that's not possible, then if you had a local school district, this is going to have policy implications, so I want you to listen very carefully. Let's say there was a local school district called Sophietown. All right, and in Sophietown, their middle school made it. We could appeal to the Sophietown and say, can our students use your school as one of the choice schools? The board would decide, yeah, I don't mind, Lake Bluff is great, we would love to have the Lake Bluff kids come over. They could actually say that would be fine, and then our kids would work out a tuition process there. Most districts, if not all districts, have adopted we will not take choice students because of taxpayer issues, because you know what you have in your community as far as numbers. I do not believe our district has done that, and that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. Because there will be times that other districts will be appealing to us if they have not already done that. So the sanction is offering choice to our kids. I don't even know, and I venture to guess there'd be very, very few middle schools in the state that would even make choice. And I would be willing to lay money down on the fact that they will not be accepting choice students.
Yeah, you think about it statistically, why would a district take choice students? Because they would be accepting kids with lower scores, which would then put them in the same boat.
Unless you're the children who abandon your school district or the children
Are
who
higher
are doing
performing.
well, in which case they would love to have them.
And you can't
Well, on
discriminate.
average,
On average, right?
You can't discriminate, so basically you either have to have the policy that you accept them or you don't.
Yeah.
Now, I will share, I'm gonna share my local community school district where I'm from has 20 schools. One of the schools made AYP in the whole district,
Holy cow.
out of the 20. So
Everybody wants to go to that school.
they had to offer all the elementary schools the choice of going there. And out of the whole district, 12,000 some odd kids, remember some of that is middle school though, 55 students have opted to go to that school. So the district is mandated to figure out the transportation. They may have had to look at their class sizes.
That could
So
really
you need
change
to know in
things.
a larger district, this could really have implications. Now, the other things you need to be aware of, which we will never get to that point, but in my former district, there were many districts around me that had been on AYP status for years. And that they had to encounter offering tutoring for their students, offering some online programs at home for students that weren't making AYP. And they were all supplemented financially by the state, but that was an additional cost for these school districts too. So you need to be aware
Offer
of
those
that.
things to, specifically to the students who weren't
Were not,
making,
yes.
but not to the others. Not to the children who are already making.
So the reason we are identified for school improvement is because this is now our third year not making AYP, because of the length of time we've not made AYP?
Because we have not made it for 3 years. And if you look at the middle school, how many groups do we have that's not making it at the middle
Just
school?
one.
Just one. And that's our students with disabilities,
Yeah.
where we would have needed to reach 39.5, and we were at 31.1.
And did that subgroup have to be at least 45 people?
Correct. So,
So we've got over 45 people with disabilities in
at the
our-
middle school. Now, what that could also mean though, and when Kevin reports, he'll actually give you examples. That also includes speech students. I was a speech student. I had a problem with my R's. That had no impact on my student achievement. So Kevin will actually give you some breakout numbers with that. So I think what you can see, there's lots of information to read. I ran off everything I could find for you. We find, even Kevin and I called Kevin on the weekend to say, am I reading this right? It looks to me like the elementary school made AYP. And on the website we were looking at, it said we made AYP. Versus this website that says we didn't make AYP. So things are still changing. We're still finding out answers. But it's important for you to know that we have become at the middle school a choice school. I'm not really sure, we still have to go through the sanctions booklet because obviously we can't offer choice in the school district. I think Mark's question is a good one, and I think it's something that I'm very curious about. I want to see comparable data. And I think the one thing that's very encouraging to me is that to even go up 1 percentage point, even under the new cut scores, is significant, especially in a district this size. That does not mean that we don't have a lot of work to do. Doesn't. So, but I think it's important as board members you see the overall. And I think it's important that you formulate questions that you can think of. Because if there's a particular area that you would like to hear more about in the October Student Achievement Report, you'll need to let us know. Keep in mind that we are also, according to the strategic plan, going to be doing check-in dates. So you'll be able to hear mid-year progress reports either through if we use map testing or if we were to use in one of our other tests, Ames Web, we can see how our students are progressing on those goals.
And you have to have a performance improvement plan to address these, right? Or no?
That's a good question also. It's called a school improvement plan
Okay, sorry.
or a district improvement plan. And actually in a district this size, both of the school improvement plans become the district plan. And the state now has mandated a new program and we have to enter our data in for that. One of the things that I will be giving you, because I saved it, I thought it was outstanding. There is a special website, I love it, it's called the IIRC, Illinois Interactive Report Card. And there, on that you can compare yourself with other districts, you can look to see financials, you can look to see their demographics, you can look to see overall information. At last year's school board conference, there was actually a presentation, and it was called the School Board's Members Handbook on the IIRC. And so I kept it, and after Kevin's done his report, I will give you a copy of the handbook, knowing that all the scores will be updated Halloween, and you can go in and kind of play around with the comparables and take a look at our new data, because it's a great website. The other thing that we've done this year, which will be helping us, is that same website is where we're storing data for our use. So we're downloading our MAP scores and some of our other scores, so teachers have one site to look at student data. You won't be able to see it, but there's actually an internal site for school district staff to look at, so they can actually use the data for improvement.
And that site will be updated at the end of October?
October
There's still the old-
31st.
There's still the old data, so
Still old data right now. We can get into the new data,
I can't.
but it will be public as of October 31st.
How many students are in the students with disabilities subgroup at the middle school? Do we have any idea?
Do you have any guess? It's over 45.
Right, it would be over 45.
I want to say that last year it was in the 70 to 75 student range
Okay,
For the district. For the whole-
at the middle school.
at the middle school,
As she
right.
asked specifically for us.
Right, so, and let's say it's 75, and then about 30% of those students are making it. So you can assume it's maybe, somebody else can do the math, but, so you've got maybe 40 students that
That's correct.
are not making it. So you
That's
can,
correct.
okay, determine about the number of students. Okay.
And that's another thing, Julie, which leads us to a conversation that I've had with Kevin. We need to continually, when we look at our curriculum, we need to be looking at curriculum for our special education students also. So we want them to we have the same standards and expectations for them, but sometimes they need different supplemental materials or even some different curriculum materials to gain their knowledge of the areas. And that's something that we'll be working on with Joanne Johannes and with Ann Rochelle, who's our language arts consultant, to make sure that we have the resources that we need for our special needs kids at the middle school too.
Are you using special needs and students with disabilities as
Yes.
interchangeably?
Yes.
Okay, so when we see students with disabilities, that doesn't mean a disability like diabetes, it means a learning.
That's correct.
It's a learning
Okay.
disability.
Students with IEPs only are included on the AYP report.
And we have a program either in place or going into place that will be targeting these kids with improvement plans that can be tracked on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. There are two ways that we do that. First of all, through our school improvement plan is one way. And so through the school improvement plans, we target individual student groups and then in certain situations, individual students to help improve their student learning. So that's one way. The other way is through their individualized educational plans. And so a lot of the students who did not meet or exceed the state standards, we would include that as an IEP goal for the upcoming year. And so we'll be working with all the staff on updating IEPs to add a goal or to enhance a goal in some way as we get rolling into the school year.
Just a question. In my day, of course, if you didn't make it, they held you back a year. Fortunately, that
Oh, that's
only happens in kindergarten. Does that ever happen anymore?
I would tell you that that is the question of the hour. And the reason for that is some kids you'd be holding back for a while, and it really, educational research will tell you that holding a child back is not going to increase their academic achievement. What we should be doing is making sure the supports are in place so they can meet those standards. It's a question, though, that I get often from people. Because they'll say, well, what about the high school kids that graduate high school and have no skills? And so I think it's a good question. We do not believe in social promotion. But I think in this era, especially with response to intervention, which you have helped deliver some of those interventions, I think that our bigger responsibility is making sure that they're getting the support.
Sometimes there are kids, and I was one of those, who just barely make it into kindergarten on the age limit. So I was a very young graduate at the age of 17. Very young was different. And for those kids, socially you're not ready. I wasn't ready until I was in 11th grade, but socially you're not ready. And other aspects of your life aren't there. So, but that doesn't occur, as you just indicated. So
It's a good question, though. And I think Kevin talked about too, I would talk about the third piece, which I think we're really working on. Let's pretend that all of the board is in the group that did not make standards. And they're not IEP students. They might be students of poverty. Okay, so there's no IEP. None of you made it. It's our goal as educators to be looking at all of you and saying, okay, here's the list. And we're gonna start with, okay, Leanne, she really had problems with comprehension. We're gonna give her the making meaning intervention, and we're gonna give her the XYZ intervention. And we're gonna monitor her every week for 8 weeks and see if that works. Now Julie, her big issue is with comprehension and speed of read fluency. So we're gonna give her 2 other interventions for 8 weeks. And then all of our teachers, we're gonna give all of you your little plans. So remember how the board talked about individual plans? That's where we're gonna be going, because all of you are gonna have plans so you can meet standards. But in a school system like this, we have the capability, once we get our systems in place, to do that for all children. So if Jean Sophie is excelling and she's exceeding, remember how hard it is to push those exceeding kids on? We need to have a plan for her on what we're gonna do to keep her challenged. So we have RTI, response to intervention. We keep looking at how the interventions are working for all of you. We may exit you from the intervention because now you're caught up. We may change the intervention for you. We may keep doing the intervention to see if it works down the road. And eventually, if those interventions are not working and you keep giving interventions for a year or more, then Kevin's team has to get together and say, we might have to look at having an IEP for this child. So it really, it is looking at individual plans for all students. Legally, right now, we have IEP plans for our special needs students. But down the road, we're starting this year with some RTI plans that are actually in the program that we have for our special ed teachers to use.
And then earlier you identified kids with RTI. Doesn't the research show that they may not have to be on an IEP plan or on an IEP plan as long?
That
Or
is
it might be a
correct.
milder IEP plan by getting them started in RTI early.
That is correct. So there's a lot changing in our world and in our profession. And there's good news and bad news. And I think that after Kevin does his student achievement presentation, at one of my superintendent corner dates, it'll probably be the November date, the parents will get the same presentation that you get as a board, and we'll answer questions from them because they'll need to hear that also. There'll be a morning session and an evening session, so all parents are able to attend, and we'll talk about what all this means.
You know, when we had a presentation from Joanne Trahanas, I think last year, but it could be the year before, on how curriculum was going and how we specifically were using technology to support delivering the curriculum. She was talking about a lot of the textbook, what would have been textbook materials now being delivered online, so that it had advantages of being able to be updated all the time, but also that it could deliver material in several different ways. So one student could click on something that would read a passage to them, another one could watch a video, there might be additional work that somebody else could do with it. And I think that would be a nice thing to have presented again or update us on it and how we're doing with that, particularly with the new board. And, you know, maybe comment on how that helps, because it seems like that would help with this issue where you've got certain, you know, you've got some groups of kids that aren't performing as well. It would seem like,
Customizable a little bit.
yeah, and maybe I'm wrong, but it'd be nice to hear about that if it's possible.
And just a reminder, the comparable data will be available in November, and we'll offer that for you. But I think you're going to be hearing a lot more on the news. People are choosing to do their board presentations earlier than normal this year, so they have time to really sit down and explain to their parents. Especially in a high-achieving district like this, parents are going to want to be able to understand it.
So stay tuned.
So stay tuned. Any other questions before we move on? Lots of handouts. They'll all be on the website. We'll get those downloaded tomorrow.
You covered everything you want to cover for AYP?
Yes.
All right, so we're going to move on to item 4, which is discussions and policy discussions. And I need to unlock my computer. We are going to move into discussion of whatever that is, 9 or 10 different policies. And if we can begin with, do you want to lead us through this, Jean?
I'd be happy
Be the
to.
best way to do that? The ethics and gift ban?
And I will share with you, the majority of these policies are what I would consider easy policies. I saved the best for last, the fund balance policy, because I know you'll want to have some discussion on that. But the ethics and gift ban policy, and again, I want to remind you, we get the policy updates from press. Press is through the school board organization.
Policy review?
I don't even know.
It's an IA,
Service.
yeah, IASB.
It's a service, and the people that actually write the updates are representatives from, there's administrative representatives, but there's attorneys from all the firms. One of Hodges and Louise's attorneys sits on it. And when we get updates from our attorneys, they'll say to us, you know, use the press policy. Or they'll say, a lot of times in that section 5 personnel, they'll say, we have a policy we'd like to replace instead of the press policy. So instead of having them review, every time a board will tell me or direct me, you need to clear this with the attorneys, I do. Otherwise, if it comes from press, it's been checked by attorneys because they wrote the press. So policies, you can always add things to if you need to. Some districts will do that if they have a particular issue that they want to make sure that they address. When we do policy next month, I think you all will have to ooh and ah on the social media policy that this district spent a lot of time on, because it's a very well-written policy. But in the meantime, we're just gonna go through ethics and gift ban. I will always give you a blurb on what press says and why we're reviewing it. Basically, all they're doing here is talking about, you cannot accept gifts from anybody that's registered from the state of Illinois or from a lobbyist. So for instance, if through my superintendent organization, we have a lobbyist, she can't be taking me out and whining and dining me over the dollar amount, because otherwise she could be swaying me to get superintendents to work on her cause. Ethics and gift ban, in my experience, there's 2 major issues that it deals with. Number 1, it's administrators and board members accepting gifts from vendors. There is a dollar amount so that you can't be bought. The other thing that I've noticed with ethics and gift ban, it will come up a lot during board elections and sometimes negotiations, and just the different things that are listed in there as far as responsibilities. So I think it's important. Elections are a big one. I'll give you for instance, board members could not circulate a petition if they were running for the school board during school time.
On school
So,
grounds.
on school grounds. So they're just, those are the 2 basic ones. But if you take a look at the policy itself, it shows the changes that they suggested. And I would leave it to you to discuss and direct me if there need to be any changes. If you look at number 5, that was their addition.
Jean, I certainly don't have any problem with the suggested changes. Looking at the policy overall and you know, understanding where it comes from, and it may be a good starting point. And this comment holds true for a number of the policies we're going to discuss. I nonetheless believe that they can be improved upon, or at least we should discuss taking out maybe some of the legal references, maybe clarifying some of them that I find very discombobulated. One of my suggestions on this one that I'd like to put out there is I see that there is a $75 per person allowance for entertainment, and that's on a single day. I have no problem with that, but I'm wondering if we don't have some process for disclosure. If people are being entertained by vendors, I think that would be useful information to know. And perhaps we supplement this policy with something that says that to the extent that there's entertainment going on, that it's disclosed. There's an annual disclosure sheet or something like that. Anyone else have a reaction to that?
I'm fine with that. Hadn't occurred to me. I don't have a problem with it.
It's fine with me.
I hadn't thought of it either, but it seems like, assuming that the administrative burden is not overwhelming.
If the administrative burden is overwhelming, that's what we want to know about. Hopefully it won't be, because there's not a lot of that. Some of it, certainly, who would, grudge anyone a dinner out or something like that, but if there is a lot, I think that's something that we want to know.
Sure. The additional comment, though, on making them read better, which I'm sure there's plenty of room for opportunity there. I want to just balance the need for that against the need to be able to update them simply. So if we have customized policies, then we won't be able to simply adopt the press policies going forward. We'll have to continually
Discuss and
update. And so while I do appreciate the value of a nicely written policy, a cleanly written policy, there is that kind of tension for me. On matters unlike social media, which we did edit and edit again, where I think the wording is crucial to get right, especially with many school districts around us having very difficult issues arise with social media, chatting,
That was a
texting.
policy in its infancy too, not well developed.
Exactly. So I think there are policies that deserve that level of editing, irrespective of how much trouble it will be to go back and correct them going forward. I don't know whether or not this one is one of them, but I do feel that tension a bit. The ability to update and keep current being a highly customized effort going forward seems to me a downside to making it read better now.
Yeah, that's a valid point. I'll tell you, the ones that really jumped out at me as being confusing is the policies on bullying. And you've got two that are quite redundant, and frankly, both are very unclear to me. And that would be one where I think we'd want to be fairly district specific anyway. This first one I had no problem with, other than my suggestion.
I would agree with you there.
And we've had some talks about bullying and harassment in the past where the wording is kind of slick.
So what do you want to do with disclosure? Do you want me to add that in?
I'd be interested in adding disclosure.
As well as if other people have significant additions or changes. But I agree with Susan. We need to balance the need for keeping this moving forward with times when we really need to drill down. So that particular policy, board member development, I think that's a fine point. And if anybody else has other things they want to add to it or cross out, that's fine too. Board member development.
What are we gonna, so I should go ahead and bring it back. When I bring it back for second reading, you still have the option of changing it prior to vote. So I will add something in number 8, page 204, on annual disclosure sheet.
Right, thank you.
Jean, is there anything comment you want to make on board member development?
No, it's just all that was changed due to the law.
Does anybody have any suggested changes or deletions to that?
No.
The only thing that I think I would ask after the strategic planning is in the board planning calendar, is that we go back to the board self-evaluation. And just like we have annual reviews, I would ask that the board have at least or at least once every 2 years, have a board self-evaluation.
And that's not in there?
No, it just says we'll conduct periodic self-evaluations.
Oh, I think that's a great idea.
So I think that the board should, I don't know if I would expect annual like everybody else, but I would say at least
I think
once every 2
ISB
years.
recommends semi-annual, actually, if I recall from my board president's training, but I would say at least annually.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
Susan?
I mean,
I'm so
No,
perplexed.
I was puzzling about something else. No, that's fine.
I would,
That's fine.
I would just
Absolutely fine.
comment that just, things may be good ideas, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be in the policy.
Yep.
So, it's flexible as written. I think it's a good idea to do. I don't know that we necessarily need to change the policy to reflect that.
Agreed.
Well, it does give you a target, though. I mean, otherwise, you're fishing around, do we do it every 6 months, do we do it every 2 years? I mean, if you put it in the policy, at least it gives you a target to see.
And you're
sometimes-
accountable to it then.
Or what about tied to election years? 6 months following an election, you have to have one or something, because election years is when we change out people, and you really need to address the way boards work together. Another possibility.
That's why some boards say once every 2 years.
Mhm.
Then they're held accountable to have one once every 2 years. That's the only thing that's different from any other district I've been in.
I mean, that's fine, right? Just say we're gonna do it every 2 years, but we know we're gonna do it as needed anyway, so.
Right. So what do you want me to do with it?
I don't feel strongly.
Either way's fine with me.
If that's your recommendation, I would go with your recommendation. Because we
Thank
trust you.
Okay, so the next one.
Committees?
That one was in the board packet right after you had your committee discussion. If you notice, the policy and legal references did not change. A footnote was rewritten. For some reason, and I had everybody playing with this, trying to insert what press said on this one into my chart just was not working. So it had to go on the last page. It was not in numerical order. I apologize. The one committee that I think that we'll be updating you on in the next year or so is this, the para and joint committees.
These are mandatory committees, right?
These are mandatory committees. They're really administrative committees, but where the impact lies is the board needs to understand what the committees will be doing once student growth comes into the picture. So I think that's the big piece with that. And because it was in press for this particular time, I just figured I'd put it in so the board could see what press says about committees. So that's why it was part of the packet.
Right.
Any other suggestions, comments, questions? I will share with you that we must have a parent-teacher advisory committee of some kind. And so we'll have to be able to get that in. To that committee, at least once a year, we bring up things like we talk about discipline. We will be talking about some other items in relation to discipline. So,
Okay. Equal opportunity and minority recruitment.
Yes.
Sorry.
5.10.
this is one that I would recommend that we hold off because Terry has our Section 5 policies.
Okay.
We have to change it for our discrimination and complaint managers. And then Terry, when she comes out, will go through our Section 5, keeping in mind that some of our Section 5 is tied to our negotiated agreement. So some of Section 5 is going to have to change after the contract also.
Okay.
So when is
Well-
she scheduled to come out?
I'm going to try to get her for the October meeting so we can talk about negotiations. But that's something that I wanted to talk about at the next board meeting, although it will be the same. All of you will be at the next board meeting, so. That, I think the October closed session is when you and I put on the board planning calendar.
So do we move through that, or do we?
For tonight, I would say, because it may need to be tweaked, I know there's a lot of things in there, and I would suggest you wait until Terry comes to talk about it. She may have already made some changes, and then you can direct her to make some of your changes, but right now, we need to get the names changed.
And does that same discussion apply to 5.2 workplace harassment?
Same
Good.
one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll go through 5.1 and 5.2 in October with Terry Hodges from Hodges and Louisi. And 7.2 harassment of students prohibited. Another issue with names.
Yes,
We have to change to reflect new names from the district who are
Exactly.
responsible for those. Are there other issues that people want to bring up with regard to?
Yeah. As I look at 7.2 and 7.18, that's where I was referring to the substantial overlap. And frankly, I think this is a policy that we want to be very clear. And I don't find this one to be particularly clear at all. So this is one where I don't know if Terry has alternatives she can provide to us, or whether we want to take what's here and take our own shot at it.
She went over this one, she went over the bullying with us pretty specifically. Was it last year or the?
She did.
Mhm.
So maybe that suggests she's already done what she's,
So this is what she
This
recommends.
might be what
I
she
mean, I
recommends.
guess one of my preliminary questions is, who's the target audience for this policy? It seems to me that there may be one policy that would be appropriate for students, for them to read and absorb, another policy that might be appropriate for parents, another policy that's appropriate for administration. When you get into all, the superintendent shall develop and maintain a program that, I mean, maybe you break that out into a separate policy, because it seems to me you want something that parents can go to, students can go to, quickly absorb, understand, that applies to them.
This would be students and parents. The administrators, the board sets the policy.
Mhm.
The administrators are charged with carrying through on the policy. And this would be for the students and the parents to know what the board policy is. And if we get into bullying in the workplace, that would be section 5, which is our staff policies. So
Right.
this is a student policy.
Well, I understand that part of it, that this applies to students, but nonetheless, you've got two different policies, or you talk about bullying on the basis of the protected characteristics like nationality, race, color, and then it goes into the general conduct that can constitute bullying. I just think it's a very confusing policy.
One of
I think
the
we can do better.
One of the comments that I remember making last time, and I've made it to Jean this time on both of these policies, was I've always felt on a lot of these types of things is the more specific you try to get, the more you risk leaving something out, especially in this day and age of creative and inventive bullying and harassment with all these different cyber techniques and whatever kids do. They'll always think outside the box and be creative with that. And does this give an administrator the power to act if they recognize bullying that is not specifically mentioned on here that they know is bullying? I mean, in your gut, everybody knows bullying when they see it. It's hard to describe, but does this give them the power to address that? That's a concern I had.
Right. I mean, I would take the position that the administration always has the ability to address any situation, whether it's in the policy explicitly or not. And I do think you want to give some examples, but again, I think clarity is important. And
I would share, as I'm looking at these, I'm gonna go back to Leanne's comment, and then I'm gonna go back and say, board sets policy for the district, so this is your decision. I do remember though, Terry came in and it was reviewed March 5th, 2013. So she just came in and went through the bullying policy. The last time the harassment of students policy was reviewed was in October of 2010.
I think they
So-
definitely need to be reviewed simultaneously for some of the reasons that Julie said. I'm surprised it was that recent, but I'll take your word for it. That's all I
says
can
in
say.
the-
Well, I remember questioning
But-
stuff in
Yeah.
the bullying policy.
But I know we did talk about it in the last year. I'm just surprised it's only been 6 months. But in any case, I recall thinking, boy, there's still a lot of room for improvement here, but moving on. And frankly, had a lot of pressing issues. But I think if we're going to look at these two, we need to look at them simultaneously. And I agree with Julie, there's plenty of room for improvement. And this is one, unlike the others that I was referring to, that I do think we have a need to be on the forefront of getting it right.
So if I can get Terry to come in and talk about a couple of these, she could talk about these. The only time constraint I have is per school code, the bullying needs to be reviewed by the board every October. So if we review it, I guess we could say the first reading, we could save the first reading to be the October board meeting and have her discuss it with you, and then come back in November to do the final changes that you direct her to do.
I'd be interested in what other districts, do they just adopt press?
Other districts just adopt press. They as I said in the very beginning, what I see as the changes to press are when a district has an issue
Yeah.
and they don't feel like they were covered by the policy, then they make the changes. But because of the rapid changes and because of the time constraints, what I've seen is there's certain policies that boards are a little bit more passionate about. harassment and bullying is one, discipline is always one.
Mhm.
And we have to review that because we have not reviewed that since I've been here. And I think as a board, you need to. So,
What I would ask Terry to do is to look at these two policies, incorporate them into one policy, maybe with subparts, to eliminate some of the redundancy and to make it clearer. I mean, I can do it.
Are they separate
they
because of
have
a
to be
matter of
separate for a
law?
reason, and I can't remember if she
Well,
talked to us
Isn't
about
it,
that.
it doesn't, because you legally have to have a bullying policy, maybe there legally has to be a harassment one too or something?
I'm pretty sure that they have to be separate because I remember her talking.
But they could
that's-
still, I mean, they could still sync up better, is what you're saying.
They can do
Right.
them side by side. As they
Right.
put
So
together.
what's the best way for us to go about this? To have, for you to talk to us about what you want to change, to submit comments to Terry, have her look at it, and then we talk about it? I mean, what do you,
I think probably the best would be if you could give me, and I'm gonna take notes. I will take good notes on comments that you have on it, and I'll have Terry do a little bit of work, or you can ask, when Terry comes in October, we can sit down and talk to her about it then, make the changes and bring them back for the November meeting. It really depends on what you guys wanna do.
This seems to me the ideal situation where a committee can really, I mean, I'm not a big fan of like small committees, but this one is really an editing version, which 8 of us are not gonna edit this thing. There is no way.
I don't know that we need to though. I mean, I think the only person who has stuff to change in it is Julie, so.
I do too.
Oh, well then, okay. But I mean, both of your comments could be given to Terry, we could get back with something and vote on it, right?
Somebody needs to sit down and rewrite the policy. I mean, the concepts are fine. They are just not well communicated, which I think can be frustrating to parents and others who are trying to get meaning out of this in a clear and simple way. So, whether we can do it, Susan and I can, I've just volunteered you, Susan, we can work on it as a committee. We can ask Terry just to take a fresh look. Maybe another district has asked her to do this. I can do it. I don't particularly care. As between your two alternatives, I would prefer the latter one because I'd rather come prepared. I didn't make detailed notes about what I would change.
So let's have her come, and then possibly after her discussion, we can get together a couple people and work through it. Because I would ask that I be part of that also, and then we can submit to her and she can make any changes.
Right, I think that's good, and then she can educate us on what we have to have.
Okay.
And why it's done the way it's done, and maybe we'll be enlightened by that.
Sounds good.
All the quiet people over here okay with that?
I'm fine with that, but I am concerned, as you mentioned, getting so specific on policy that you almost handcuff the
Administrators?
administrators from doing something because it gets too specific and
If it's not there, it can't be bullying, right?
yeah.
And typically that's, the way that's dealt with in situations like this is to give a broader policy with examples that give violations of this policy include but are not limited to the following types of things.
It doesn't have enough
right?
of that kind of include but not limited to language in there.
We can't, right, we can't be the first people that have struggled with this. We can't be the first 2 employment lawyers on a board, right? But I think having her come is absolutely important. But I don't want to undervalue the importance of having a prior discussion of some kind, or I don't know what would be appropriate, but a conference call where we can understand how we landed, where we landed in March. For me, I remember sort of thinking, okay, we've got other things we're going to be doing.
She
so let's
actually
move
made
on.
changes to the policy.
I
based
remember,
off of that.
I know, which for me at the time felt like tweaks rather than corrections, you know what I mean? And so, while I agree with having her come and talk about it, I think the level of specificity that I and Julie may go through would be overkill for others. So I'm just suggesting maybe the 4 of us, you and me and Julie, and talk first before we subject everyone to that kind of discussion.
Can I just add one pretty specific note to it? it looked to me like when I read it that bullying was prohibited at school and on the school bus. But I wondered, maybe you can't do this, but I wondered if you could say anything about bullying that happens on the way to and from school. Because I heard some reports of stuff happening at the park across the street from the middle school last year.
I would share a couple items for you, and there are things to think about. All school boards that I've worked with and other school boards, you get into what's called a very gray, murky area where you do not want, as a school board, to be responsible for outside
Right.
that. And I think and I know Terry, because I've heard her talk about it with the board, she's gonna wanna say to you, what do you wanna be responsible for? If you start talking about the walk to school, and then you're talking about parents driving their kids to school, and then what happens, she's gonna tell you if it's on school property and the bus stop. That's all she's gonna tell you.
So if the school learned about something that happened across the street, that could not be a part of a disciplinary action on the part of the school.
It could be if the board wanted that to happen, but I
Okay,
think
but right now it could not, and
No.
you're saying she would recommend against that.
How about,
she would
well,
recommend
okay.
against it.
just to be the devil's advocate, our middle school kids take recess at the park across the street, which is
That's
not
during instructional time.
during instruction time. Okay, so it's coming.
Okay.
I think the other thing that I'm gonna get back to, and you're gonna hear me say this a lot, I cannot emphasize enough, the board sets policy, so it's up to you guys, whatever you guys wanna do. If I'm adamant about something, I'll tell you I'm adamant, but I have to tell you, this is one of your most important jobs. So if you're uncertain about something, then you need to do what you need to do to be satisfied, because I will guarantee you that something could come up that you'll say to yourself, I wish we would have rewritten this policy, or I wish we had a policy for this.
Well, I'd like to Leanne's point, I'd like to learn more about the Pandora's box we open ourselves up to by including something about being en route to or from school.
I would keep this as narrow as possible, as defined and narrow as possible.
I think I get that perspective, but I also understand from a child's point of view that they don't distinguish when bullying happens. That doesn't matter to them if it happens on the grounds or while they're walking to school. It affects them the exact same way. So I would like to ask the
I
question.
mean, even if it's, the school will inform law enforcement if it becomes aware of bullying that's taking place. I don't know.
Well, we have to-
It seems like the school ought to respond somehow if that happens, but I
there's
understand
a
we don't
way.
want to be responsible for,
Policing
everything
the
that.
town.
And I would share with you that right now, the school is taking responsibility by Nate calling parents. He does call parents about that.
Okay.
But he will not, and he'll have one of his Mr. Blackmore discussions, but there is not discipline with that, if it's after school or before school.
Okay.
So, and not on school grounds, and not part of instructional time.
I also want to make the point that policies generally, I mean, they're not statutes, they're not set in stone. The board sets policy not just by what it writes on the paper, but on the case-by-case situations that it addresses as it sees fit in those particular circumstances. I don't think we want to overpromise, because then we assume a responsibility to act that we may not want to ultimately have. But if we learn of a particular situation, there's no reason we can't address that particular situation as the need may be. So these are important, but we're not hamstrung by them either. Policy should be fluid.
And if I feel that we're hamstrung by something, it's our job to come to you and say, this policy isn't working for us. So, but this is your job as a board,
Okay.
so it's very important.
So going forward, sounds like we're gonna have some prior conversation prior to meeting
Right.
with Jean between the three of you guys. Does that constitute, here's what I'll get my clarity of my question, does that constitute a board-appointed committee?
No, because there's only two.
Doesn't matter the
Oh,
size.
I
If it's
see
a
what you're
board
saying.
committee,
Okay,
it
yes,
has
we
to
have
be
to have
posted.
minutes.
If it's officially a committee, or you're just having a superintendent's meeting, because that's
No,
different
it's-
also.
I don't think we're creating a committee.
If you even
We don't-
use the word committee, it has to be, it's subject to open meetings.
But if we're
Yeah.
having a discussion about the policy, just that policy, so we're pulling it together just for this right now,
Yes.
then it's just a discussion.
And we were going to have Terry present, so it'd be attorney-client privilege.
Well,
So whether we have to post and then go into closed session and.
No, we wouldn't go to closed session with this, though. This is a.
That
Do you
makes
want
sense.
Terry present? Do you want to, so you're
Yeah.
suggesting that we have a phone
Sorry.
conference with Terry? We could easily do that before the next meeting.
That's what I was suggesting.
Yeah,
is a
that's
phone
what I
conference
thought
With Terry.
I'm just trying to make sure we do it legally.
Yeah.
you know.
Sort of, what are?
How about if
what are
I
our
take direction from
options?
Terry?
Good idea.
Yeah, I mean,
Ask
it
her
can
how
be
to best do
posted
this.
and whatever to meet, to cover that requirement without having a committee established with.
I'll tell you what would be easiest is I know that I have several things that I will be meeting with her on in the next couple of weeks. I'll check both of your calendars before I set up my meeting with her. And we'll call from her office and put you guys on conference call. And I'll find out ahead of time, how we're gonna post it. But as long as I know it's not a committee and we're just meeting on this particular issue, I'll let her know
And
that,
she can
she'll ask
clarify
me that question.
Yeah, good. Okay. We moving on? You guys, anybody else have, John, you didn't say anything in that whole conversation. Is there anything you want to make? You're
I'm
good?
just listening.
Okay. And my screen went blank and hard, sorry. We are up to student records, 734, I believe.
Yes, this was, the definition of student school records is amended. So it gives you all the information on what we need to be following. They did make some significant changes to this particular policy, which you can see by their red line strikeout. And as I've shared with all of you, we're really working on student records, procedures. We now have locked cabinets with student records. There's sign-outs for those. And we're going to be in-servicing staff on really what constitutes a student record and how those can be communicated, so. Anything in this particular item?
The student biometric information collection,
I saw that.
what's that all about? Do we need that? We don't do that.
That's for the future, right?
Actually, there's going to be a lot more information discussed with this on the enhanced PE committee that I sat on. School districts are now required to do some sort of testing, and here we do, what test did I tell you we do?
Fitnessgram.
Fitnessgram. So, this is all, when I hear biometric, I start getting a little eerie, thinking, what are we releasing on kids? But it's really just general fitness. I think the big piece in here for me was it means any information that's collected through an identification process for individuals based on their behavioral or physiological characteristics, fingerprints, hand geometry, voice, facial recognition.
I like retina scans.
You know, you
So-
laugh,
It's not that
it
far
won't be
away.
that long.
Yeah, probably not. And it'll be an app.
I don't think so.
Hold your face to the phone.
So right now, we really don't have a whole lot of items in this particular thing, but they put this in a while ago because they know that the law is kind of moving this way. I would tread on this one very lightly because as a parent and as a superintendent, we have to be very protective of that data, of any data, which we don't collect any of that stuff in there anyway.
Anybody, questions? All right, 6.12, education of children with disabilities.
This was just a review policy, as was 7.230. One of the things that Kevin and I had talked about was we needed to make sure that we're covered and our policies were up to date in these areas, especially as we move into starting to look at our discipline policy, which I'll be bringing to you when you have significant time. That'll be like the fund balance policy that you're gonna wanna have some discussion on. So I think you just needed to review them. They were actually in press for review only. No suggestions were made, but it's a good point for you to review the policies.
So it's not a legal requirement to review
No.
it X number of years?
No.
Okay,
It's best practice.
which is good.
So unless there's any questions, which there may be, so.
Do we have a committee that's referred to in here? The Board of Education will establish and maintain a committee to develop, implement, and monitor procedures on the use of behavioral interventions for children
Yes.
with
It
disabilities.
gets, I was on it one year,
So that.
Was on it,
before I was
yeah.
on the board.
It convenes once a year to review the stuff and.
So it's a committee outside
It's a
the board?
floating committee.
I see, okay.
And it can be combined with other committees that we have. So if we have a general parent group that includes parents of students with disabilities, they can review that portion of the policy as well.
Okay, got it, thanks.
It's a
Okay.
good question, because we ask those questions every day. Do we have that committee? Where does it meet? And where's the agenda? And where are the minutes?
All right, discussion item 4B. Unless are there any other questions on policy other than fund balance?
No.
Moving to B, addition of teacher aid at LBES in early childhood.
Kevin has documented exactly what I've kept you up to date with through our kindergarten memos and through our early childhood. So he's got the numbers in front of you, and we're now asking at this point to make permanent for the year the addition of the aid that we put in to start the school year out with. Kevin, do you want to give any more information on some of the needs and kind of what you see that aid doing in the classrooms?
As you discussed at your last Board of Education meeting, when there was a discussion about the kindergarten class size of 22 and the large number of students in that classroom, we looked at alleviating that in a number of ways.
We're talking about the half-day class, right?
The half-day classroom, the enrollment was at 22. We looked at trying to move some of those students into full day through a number of means.
We moved two, because it
we
used to be
moved
24.
Well, we moved 2 of the 24 initially, so that brought us down to 22.
Right.
22. And so that's where we stand right now. And so we have temporarily put a classroom teaching assistant in that classroom in the morning. And then in the afternoon, that classroom teaching assistant has been going to our early childhood classroom. The early childhood classroom right now, while it may seem small at 4 students, you have to understand the type of students that are in there. So there are students in there who may exhibit some self-injurious behaviors. And so they require some extra supervision, very, very close supervision to do very much education in the classroom. And so while it is only 4 students right now, it is a number that will grow throughout the year as we're required by law to work with early intervention services as students turn 3 on their 3rd birthday. If they have early intervention services through the state, we are required by law to have an IEP in place for them if needed by their 3rd birthday. So those sorts of students would also go into our early childhood program. So the number will grow. So the person will work in the morning with the half-day kindergarten and then in the afternoon with the early childhood classroom.
I think the other thing I wanted to mention is I will be emailing all of you to see if anybody's interested in school visits. It's a classroom I would encourage all of you to visit, the half-day kindergarten and the early childhood. There's some wonderful things being done. But I wanted to also keep in mind that even with the 22, with a teacher and an aide, we do have specialists that go in that classroom also. There's a lot of activity going on in that classroom. It makes me very tired even spending 10 or 15 minutes. There's a reason our new teacher looks very tired, but happy, because the kids are darling and they'll tell you exactly what's on their mind. And they're still struggling a little bit with towards that noon hour, they look like they're ready to go home and take a nap. So I can identify with them. So I would strongly encourage you to visit those classrooms also. Are there any questions on this at all? Because again, these are items so we can just put them on for vote at the next meeting then.
This is not related, I don't have a question for this, but it's related to your comment about classroom visits. That's just come up in a couple of meetings. Can you make a note to follow up with people and maybe try to schedule these things a little bit more deliberately? Because if you leave it up to us, we'll probably not follow up. But I think it's a really good thing.
So you'd like me to take the ownership rather than have the board members take ownership?
Yeah, a little bit.
Is that what you're saying, Mark Berry?
Because it's really helpful when you push a little bit.
Maybe the rest of us will take that on, and Mark just needs you to be responsible.
I would be happy to do
That'd be
that.
great. That'd be great. The name of the interim principal slips my mind.
Dr. West.
Dr. West, she can coordinate that too, perhaps.
I'll get them all coordinated. And you'll each get your own
Because
individual
it's
email.
tremendously beneficial. I did it last year. It was fantastic. Okay, any other questions on the issue of the teacher aide at LBES? We're not voting on anything tonight, just discussion and preparation.
Yeah, I just have one question. You mentioned the teacher's reaction some years ago when we had the large classroom. I remember toward the end of the year finding out that the teacher had had a difficult year, and I just want to make sure that we are staying in touch with that teacher and that we're confident that she is not feeling so overwhelmed that we really.
Do you want to address that?
We are staying in constant contact with all of our new teachers, but especially the teachers in the kindergarten classrooms, as that's the beginning of the district. This particular teacher has some experience in another district with a much larger class size.
She's in heaven.
And so her ability to work with this number of kids is really quite great. And so we're keeping in contact, and she has some great mentors at her grade level, other teachers who have been able to help out and to work with her to understand how to develop classroom management and make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Any other questions on what we've talked about so far? Okay, we're going to move on to discussion item C, which is the fund balance policy. This is what you've all been waiting for. This is a topic that's been on our plate for months and months and months. And now I think we're kind of at the point where the rubber has to meet the road and put together and craft a policy that moves this district forward in a very productive and efficient manner. It gives guidance to us and the future boards. We've done had a lot of discussions about this. I'm a little surprised to see how thin our current policy is, because, and this may not even be the current policy, because I know there's
This
something.
is our current policy.
Wasn't there something about a 25% minimum?
This is our current policy.
Okay, that was never, okay,
You know, I've noticed that's happening since you turned 50.
I know. It's been happening for a long time. So I wanted to lead off by giving John the opportunity. He asked to become our board's new self-appointed historian. And he's actually done some research in the community and was able to give us some background on some of the history that got us to the point of the tax rate referendum in 01-02, I believe it was. And I'll hand it over to John if you
Okay.
can take us through
I
that for a
thought
few
it
minutes.
was crucial to get a clear and fundamental understanding of what occurred at the time the deficit was incurred. Our fund balance is where it is today in part, and I made some notes here to make sure I didn't miss anything. Part of the result of the deficit situation and the financial warning that occurred in the early 2000s, which required the district to ask for a tax increase through the referendum process. And this led to the current situation where we now have allowed the fund balance to get up to $15 million and roughly 100% of our expenses. So I thought it would be good if I could find someone or find information that was around at that time. Fortunately, I'm friends with, and Lisa said I can use her name, Lisa Dietrich, who was president of the board at that time. And I said, can you enlighten me as to how this happened, why it happened, what the understandings and discussions were at the board level, when it occurred, and how you resolved it? And within an hour, she was at my house with a suitcase, literally, I showed it to Martha, a suitcase full of information that was very clear, and I'm going to summarize it quickly here, but she also allowed me to move forward and make copies for each of you to read, because I think it's invaluable information from a learning perspective and a historical perspective to understand this. But let me...
It looked like they had gone, just to elaborate, they were heading into referendum at the time, and they looked like they had done some extensive preparation of materials
Absolutely.
to support and win support for that
And the
referendum.
board-
So it's all really well documented.
The board in the mid to late 90s felt very strongly, as from Lisa telling me, that a minimal fund balance should be kept in place since the district's income is basically derived from property taxes. So that was their philosophy. they felt there was little risk associated with the flow of that income. So they used a zero-based budgeting process. They basically levied to meet expenses and no more. And they felt very stringently about that. So in the beginning of the year 2000-2001, the district had an education fund balance of $564,000. That's about 7% of expenses. They felt that was excessive.
And their total fund balance, their total
I was looking at the
revenues was like
about 7 million.
7 million.
Yeah, so it was about 7%. In fact, they passed the budget that year to draw down the fund balance to $100,000 or 1.5 cents. So you put that in your mind, that's where they were standing. So to begin with, this was well below the 25% that we've been talking about. Several unexpected and unbudgeted things occurred during the year which tipped the fund balance into a negative territory. And I want to go over this just quickly. They had a special needs situation, which we've talked about around this table, that arose that cost them $162,000 beyond what they expected. They had legal issues, and I know some of you are aware of the legal issues at the time. It became a national case, in fact, and that case cost roughly $185,000. They increased the language program here, which was part of the budgeted process, but they added an extra teacher to meet specific needs that were not originally considered. Their healthcare premiums increased 25% more than they expected, and they had an unbudgeted health insurance claim from an employee auto accident of $180,000. So it was like the perfect storm here occurring in expenses. But on top of that, on the income side, and Jane, I'm not by no means an expert on tax levy, but from what I understand, they were going through a depressed economy at that time, and the tax cap, or PTEL, is a formula that limits the amount of new tax dollars that a taxing body can collect. And the PTEL works by applying both the CPI and the EAV, correct? If the EAV rises at a higher rate than the CPI, which is what was happening at that time, tax rates will generally fall. And their estimate, which is in their documentation, these aren't my numbers, these are theirs, their estimate was that they were losing roughly $427,898 per year through the 90s as a result of the fact that the assessed values were increasing but the CPI was decreasing. So you add all of that together, the lack of income that they expected, the unexpected increase in expenses, and boom, they're facing...
Along with a minimal fund balance.
With no fund balance, basically. Now, I just should add, I read something interesting in there that the PTEL, or the tax cap, is by design empowers voters to have a say in taxes that are assessed because it forces taxing bodies to periodically come to voters and justify a tax increase. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's what occurred at this time. It's not a black mark. It's a process that's put in place for a specific purpose. I think it's for our purposes going into the future, it's really important to bring the magnitude into place here. So the magnitude of the problem never got beyond about $1.5 million, as I understand it, depending on the timing. Somewhere between $1 million and $2 million, let's say. So it never got bigger than that. So in fact, if they had maintained a 25% return, they would have had adequate funds and they would have never had to go into referendum. And they would have probably learned a lesson and taken the full tax levy in the future. Now, the real question is, as we move forward, how did we go from a negative number to 15 million? I don't really have any good answer to that, and I'm not here to point fingers or anything of that sort. My guess is they were a little shell-shocked, and they probably thought we really have to get this balance in order, and there were no checks and balances as it moved forward. That's just my guess. But the question before us today and in the next few weeks is to clearly state, I think, the needs and the goals for using the fund balance, and to estimate the proposed costs associated with those reasons. So the fund balance, and I distinguish the fund balance as something separate from capital projects. I mean, if we're going to fix doors and paint ceilings and even maybe replace boilers, that should be part of the ongoing budgeting process encompassed by the levy, whatever income we come from the levy. So let's set that aside for a minute, although we know we're sitting on roughly a $2.5 million need as expressed by BLLD for building purposes over the next 20 years. But let's set that aside for a second and think about how we outline the specifics of the policy. From my perspective, there's no question we should have a floor, and the floor should be 25%. 25% of where we are today is pretty substantial, and probably enough if you really think about it. And there were no fund balance policies that I read that specified a ceiling. You all read them. They all recommended not to exceed, or not to go below a certain number, but they never said what the top number should be.
Some said that they would be in the range of,
Right.
rather than.
But I think,
minimum.
right. But given our experience of collecting taxpayers' money with really no clear intent, I think becomes problematic. So the money reserve can be tempting, and there are a lot of reasons why you don't want your reserve to get high. So I would strongly recommend, as does I think the Strategic Planning Committee, that we establish some sort of cap. Even though no one else, to my knowledge, has ever done that before, I think we should probably do that. I'm not ready to consider what that cap might be, because I think we still have some unanswered questions with regard to the BLOD study that's coming forward. And I would like, for one, to understand better what we feel the fund balance specifically is to be used for, because I thought long and hard about this, and I've looked at other districts, and I really can't come up with a lot of things that would require much more than a couple $1 million. So I'm interested in hearing what other people ultimately feel, what we feel as a group or a board, and what we come up with to designate as specific uses for a particular fund balance. So in summary, I think and there were some, the superintendent at the time wrote these documents. There was some great language in there about what makes District 65 great, which I read, and I think all of you should read. And there was some very insightful, Mark, you only had an hour or so to peruse them today, and I spent a little more time. But there's some great insights into how the board was thinking and operating and dealing with these issues in a very, I think, sort of specific manner. So I think it would be helpful if you all looked at that before we made a step forward toward formalizing, let's say, our final fund balance policy.
It was useful to look at, and I think we would get some interesting insights. And to quote, and there's an old quote that I can't remember who it's attributed to, but this says that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So, as long as we're aware of the mistakes made, and from that we draw learning that we can use going forward, I think that's all very helpful.
I should just say they were very thoughtful,
Yeah.
as you might expect. They clearly knew where they were going. They just hit a spot where there were some things that occurred that were completely unexpected. But the magnitude is really what's important here. The magnitude wasn't 15 million. It was $1 million or $2 million. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we, for our own purposes, try to understand what we may face in the next 20 years.
Can we imagine the next perfect storm,
Yeah.
I suppose?
Well, and I think we should deal with that.
I just want to add one more piece of history that's changed dramatically about 2 or 3 years ago, and that is the previous collective bargaining agreement that provided, you've heard of SAVE, and that provided for some control to the teachers union of 60 to 63% of the education fund budget. They actually established that budget every year and spent those funds virtually under their own control. Whereas now the current collective bargaining agreement gives the board much more control over the budget and expenditures. So that's to the district's benefit, sorry, teachers, but
I agree that that's a significant change.
Yeah, it's a huge change.
Recognizing, however, that we had not had extreme expenses even under the prior system.
But for planning purposes ahead.
Exactly.
Now with traditional collective bargaining agreement, you know what salaries are going to
Exactly.
be, whereas the previous agreement, they levied, and then after the taxes were collected, then the salary schedule was set based on the income that the teachers got.
I also think that in looking at fund balance policies, each district has a unique and distinctively different requirements and needs. So I'm not sure we need to, or we should even rely on what other school units have done. I think it's certainly refreshing to look at what they've done, but you have to understand where their revenues are incurred, what kind of risks they have going on, and we don't have that information. What the thinking is of the board. I mean, our board, if you go back, and Lisa suggested we all go back and look at old minutes. I'm not about to do that, but some of you may like to do that. But, you really have to get a clear, I have a much better understanding of what was going on at that time, which I thought was essential to our process. But unless you have that information from other boards, it's really not very, I don't think, positive to say, well, Lake Forest is at 10%, we should be at 10. Or someone else is at 100. I know we have a chart here that's going to show others at 100, so we need to be at 100. I don't think that's very relevant to our particular needs. We just need to define for ourselves what we will be facing in the future. Looking at that magic video screen or whatever, and set up a safe and positive fund balance policy.
I would like to go around the table and hear from everybody on this, but I want to draw attention to one thing first. And that is an issue I had a brief email conversation with Jane about. Just to clarify, the engineer in me wants to make sure we're all considering apples to apples and not, there's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison that some of us have been making over the past several months. When we talk about fund balance or reserve ratio, let's be clear about what we're talking about there. And what we've been talking about and what the chart that we got, this chart shows is the ratio of reserves to expenses. Correct, Jane? But there's also been conversation about how the state has its financial rating system where it recommends, we talk about this magic 25% number. That is not fund balance. They're talking about fund balances to revenues, not fund balances to expenses. So it's a different number. I just want to make sure everybody's aware that we weren't thinking apples to apples when we kept throwing out that 25% number. And in fact, the state has five different indicators that they assign weight to when they give us the overall rating of a 1 to a 4, and only one of them is sort of similar to fund balance, and that's days cash on hand, and that's only a surrogate for that number. It's not even the exact calculation. And that they only assign a 10% weight to. The number that we were assuming was fund balance, which is actually fund balance to revenue, they assign a 35% weight to, along with an expenditure to revenue ratio, they assign a 35% weight to. But the closest measure on that calculation to reserve to expenses, which this is confusing, is only assigned a 10% weight. So just for clarity, let's try to keep in mind apples to apples and oranges to oranges and not apples to oranges.
Well, in fact, though, our revenues and our expenses have been very close.
If they're similar, yeah, you could say that that's a little.
What is the delta on that?
It's very small. Jane probably knows, but it's very small.
I graded this latest chart. It is the expenses to revenues. The chart that we created a year ago, which was the revenue to, fund balance to revenue ratio, they're very similar.
Mhm.
They're very similar. If you assume in theory a district gets $1 and
Yeah.
spends $1, revenues match, but they are very slightly. But to Mark's point, I think he's just wanting to make sure we all talk about the same thing, regardless of what it
Yep.
is. But yeah,
When
they
is
are
the final-
similar numbers.
When is the final BLD study due in?
By October 1st.
So that issue
And
that
we have
also
that
comes into
October
play.
7th meeting.
Yeah, but
That comes-
Is there any reason
does
to
that mean
believe?
we get it December? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Does that mean we get it October 1st? Because I don't want to get it on October 6th or 4th.
We have if it's gonna be ready October 1st, then you get it
They're
October 1st.
presenting October 7th, right?
I haven't asked them to present, we just scheduled the meeting.
Oh, I thought that was,
If they can come October 7th, that would be great. We'll ask them tomorrow.
I think that was the
It
impression.
might
I
be
got
useful
as
to be able to ask questions about how they came to certain conclusions in their numbers. Hard to say,
We
not
will
having
ask
seen them,
them.
but it seems like it might be a good idea.
Right, okay, so,
The days cash on hand, I know it's only worth 10%, but what's the target? What's
No,
the,
it's 3 months.
180 days is what they,
what, 6
6 months.
I don't think it was that.
I have it right in front of me, it's, let's see,
Cash on
That was in one of the handouts that I emailed. I know I've emailed you a lot this week.
Days cash on hand, oh.
I think it's in the financial profile.
Category, days cash on hand, category 4, 180 days for the highest rating.
For the
At
highest
least- at
rating,
least.
180 days.
So half a year, which is, different
Which
than
is-
50% fund balance, roughly. So,
We should look at that, it sounds like.
and another thing that occurred to me too, when we're mixing up our definitions, that might have some effect when we consider an abatement. On years when our revenue is lower than our expenses, if we do, we just had an abatement year where we abated a big chunk of money to bring some of these numbers down, so it's something to consider.
So percentage of what? We just need to be clear when we're saying eventually what percentage,
Just be
which number
careful
we're
in our
talking
language,
about.
yeah.
Because having abated, that number's lower.
So, do you guys want to go around the table and kind of philosophically talk about where you're at on fund balance and what you would like to see?
Sure.
You want to start?
I'll start. Thank you, John, for delving into this the way you have. I'm most concerned about understanding exactly, what the reason for the fund balance is and defining exactly why what is included in the fund balance. Because without that, it's pretty hard to decide anything on what kind of amounts we need to have in there.
Do you mean what's in it, like what we would use it for?
Exactly. And it doesn't seem like we've got a very clear policy on that right now. So before you start tossing around percentages and everything else, I think that has to be established first. I'm also in favor of a lower fund balance, only because I see it as money that is taken from the taxpayers without a real need for any design for how it's going to be used, other than the fact that, supposedly the state has these earmarks that we have to hit. And I don't know how important that is that we hit them for the state. But the one thing I've noticed about this community, they're very pro-education, and if we get in trouble for some reason, they're certainly not going to be turning their backs on the education of the students here.
I think the one thing I can answer with hitting the targets for the state is that it's very important that we have a good designation from the state on our financial status. And the reason for that is, in many cases, it would help our bond rating if we needed to do anything with bonds. It also shows the community that we're responsible. So when we were in financial warning from the state, that's shows that there's issues with that.
But we're far away from that now.
Right. I'm just saying as far as meeting the targets for the state, and the targets for the state are much lower. But you had mentioned why we would want to meet the targets for the state. We want to meet what their minimum, at least their minimum requirements.
Well, is that minimum requirement if they're asking for 6 months of cash? I mean, that's half the budget.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It depends on your cash flow needs.
So it's measured on June 30th of the last day of the fiscal year. And because
Could you define that better, John?
Maybe
Jane enlightened me today that a lot of this has to do when revenue comes into the district.
Right.
And
Yes,
I'm gonna
and
Jane
for
do
us
that.
in Lake County, we get what we refer to as early taxes. So the levy that the board established last year in 2012 for the fiscal year that we're in, that started July 1st, we actually got almost half of those tax monies in May and June. So we get almost half of our revenues before the fiscal year starts. So that inflates our cash balance, money in the bank.
But those are not counted in our
But
fund
that's
balance.
counted in cash on hand, but it is not counted in our actual fund balance because we are on a modified accrual accounting basis.
Were we actually in mourning?
Yes,
Because the documents I read said that we were not.
yes,
they may have
back
been-
in '03, I
Okay.
believe. So it's
Um,
been a long time.
Okay. You know what would be helpful for me if you took this year's budget and gave us what in dollars or in percentages it would be required for us to meet the highest standard? Not right now, but I mean at some point. So for example, what does 180 days in cash actually mean for the fund balance?
Okay, well, it's going to be 50%.
Doesn't it depend on when you measure cash on
Well,
hand?
but it's always as of June 30th. The
Well, but-
the financial profile is based on the audit for the end of the fiscal year ending on June 30th.
And in June 30th, what was our cash on hand?
We would exceed the 180 days. We would far and exceed the 180
Okay,
days
yeah,
because
so-
of early taxes.
So that's not a,
But that's a day when it would be unusually high,
But you
too.
wouldn't count the early taxes in that
So
number.
you do in cash on hand, but you don't in the fund balance. And it's confusing, but you do in cash on hand because it's money in the bank.
Yeah.
so are we saying that that really shouldn't influence what our fund balance policy is? Because on June
Correct.
30th every year, we're always going to have,
June
Plenty of
30th,
money.
you're going to have whatever cash in the bank you
Okay.
have. Fund balance is
That's the
something you're
number
trying
we-
to be strategic.
Yeah, that's the number we want,
to
not cash
yes.
on hand.
Yeah, not a cash on
Two
hand.
different things.
And if you're in cash basis, your cash on hand is your fund balance.
Right.
But we're on an accrual basis.
Do you want to go, Susan? Or are you going back?
I don't care who goes next, whoever has the most urgent. Ooh.
Just
Go ahead.
put the name.
I just wanted, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was, mine was a point of clarification.
Go ahead.
So looking at the white paper that you handed out, only those districts with 3 months, a 25% fund balance to expenditures gets the state's highest. That's the minimum for getting the state's highest score, correct? And that's the number we're talking about.
Right.
So we're looking, 25% would be the minimum.
No.
That's the-
No.
That's what I was
That's-
trying to clarify.
That's what he's
Okay,
saying, it's
that's
not.
why-
That's the definitional problem where
Okay.
their number is fund balance to revenues is the highest weighted number, and they're recommending fund balance to revenue should be 25% or higher.
Okay.
The number we're throwing about around here is fund balance to expenses. It's an easier number.
Well, but rather than talking about all these logistics, why don't we get real numbers here so we have something to focus on? Let's use this year's budget as an example and determine what those numbers would be. Otherwise, it's not very meaningful.
well, wasn't that just established that they're virtually the same?
They are in most cases. They're very close in our
Is
case.
there any reason to think that they won't continue to be virtually the same over the next
Abatement,
3 or 4 years?
if we abate, our revenue will be different than our expenditures.
But that's a one-year event, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all get, we just have to talk apples to apples.
Right.
Okay, for an example, in the education fund, 25% of our revenues for this year is 3.084 million. 25% of expenditures is 3.142.
It's almost,
Right.
Okay.
So that would be the floor, $3 million, $3 million. And I think 25% needs to be the floor. The question I have is whether we want to establish a ceiling and what should that ceiling be?
what do you think, Susan?
So what I jotted down was that rather than a floor and a ceiling, I preferred the target, the range. So my language was, as in unusual compelling circumstances, the board will act in a manner designed to maintain aggregate fund balances at X%. The number I jotted down was 50%. I was considering 40%. My thought there was that we need to do micro changes each year that will get us close to whatever number. And that if we establish a range, then there's a broad range within which we could fall. If instead what we have is an aspirational target where our policies are designed to approximate each year, then we will each year make the changes designed to get us closer to that target number. So in general, my thought was neither a floor nor a ceiling, but rather a target number. And like, of course, policy apparently does that with a 10% target number. That number, to me, is lower than we would want, but the thought there was that it's neither a floor nor a ceiling, but yet a aspirational or a target. Also, I noted in some of the language that we were sent, a phrase that identified that the goal of a fund balance, a goal, ought to be to stabilize tax rates over time. And I think the way that we need to be thinking about this is, rather than having this unassigned fund balance floating out there, we need to be much more planful, and I think we've all said this, about what we need to reserve in the capital fund to accrue for future known expenses or reasonable predicted expenses. And so I think rather than have this unassigned X%, we need to, through the strategic plan, come up with a much more precise definition of what we will need money for and assign the appropriate accrual amounts to that capital fund and reduce the amount of free-floating fund balance.
Can I react to that?
Please.
The only difficulty I have with no cap is, under your circumstances, what occurred in the last 10 years could easily occur again. Not with this board, but perhaps with the board 10 or 15 years from now. And that's a concern I would have. I think with a cap, you at least, there's an alert that goes up if you reach a certain level that raises the thought process.
I thought about that exact comment, and my thinking was, in some regard, similar to John, some regard different. I called it a range instead of a cap. Perhaps it was, and I'm not hard and fast on my numbers, but perhaps my range was a minimum of 40 and a maximum of 60. And yet my thinking was, if you have a hard and fast single number, do you give your administrators and board time to react to a problem? Like, once you hit that number, how do you recover from that? Whereas if you have a range, once you start entering that range, whether from the top down or the bottom up, maybe you have more time to redirect the ship so you stay within that range if you see it heading out. It's kind of where I was thinking.
It may be a distinction without a difference, frankly. I don't know.
I think it all depends on the final wording of the policy, really. You could probably word it
Right.
with a single number or a range to accomplish the same goal, I would imagine.
And if it's a range from 40 to 60 or a target of 50, we're probably saying the same thing, just semantically different. This is like negotiation, when you start talking about a number, it kind of becomes the number that you all start thinking about. I don't mean to do that. I don't know that we need to be 40 to 60, frankly, but I hear what you're saying. I'm not wedded to that. My thought was that if your goal is to act in a manner that gets you to approximate whatever that number is, let's just call it 40%. 40% over time, that you will make those micro tweaks each year to get you close to that 40%. Rather than being comfortable because you're somewhere in a broad range, you would make micro tweaks to get you closer to that 40% and thereby reduce the actual
I think
variance.
before we come to any numbers, we ought to understand clearly what worst case could possibly be.
Exactly.
Is it 2 million? Is it 10 million? I don't know, but I'd like to have a discussion or at least get some information on what that number would be. Because in the circumstance that created the warning, it was about $1.5 million, worst case.
Which was at the time
It was 10 years ago, right, I understand.
Well,
$7
think of
million,
the
so it's,
percentage of the,
right,
But
it's
I think we need
15%.
that information before I'm ready to dictate any percentages whatsoever.
I don't even think we ought to talk numbers until we decide what our policy, what that fund is going to be used for.
Right.
And my discussion of range was not to specifically lay out any. My argument for putting a range in was not to say that was my recommendation on the numbers, but to make a recommendation that I like the idea of a range as opposed to a specific number. And you guys want to?
I think everyone's
I mean,
saying
I have
Yes.
a couple comments about this too. I think it seems to me we ought to try and meet what the state requirement is for their highest rating. It seems to me that if there's some other measure that people who are determining bonds are going to use, It seems like we want to be in a good position for that. I think that the community is concerned with education. It concerns me that when we put the middle school in, that referendum passed by a very slim margin, like less than 20 votes. So I just would keep that in mind. I'd like to see us have this process tightened up so that we know exactly what that money would be for and how it would be used. But to my mind, it's almost like we need to have two separate conversations, because what we say about our fund balance policy and how we're going to levy in the future is one thing. Then how do we deal with the situation that we're in now? Because even if you think that we ought to save over time for capital expenses, or you think that we should go back and levy for capital expenses, the fact of the matter is we do have a capital expense of some size that's going to come up. And I think that we should, I think that the funds we have on hand right now, we should factor that in to that decision. In other words, we know we have work that's going to need to be done at the middle school. I think before we come to a point of saying, okay, well, you know, we want to be at 30% or 50% and dispatch that money, I feel like we need to have a plan of how we're going to manage those facilities.
I think we're all in agreement there.
Yeah.
But remember, the BLD study total $2.5 million for the building portion. So we already know what that number is. We don't know the education.
That's for maintenance of that portion,
Right.
as opposed to if we're reducing
But
debt.
we'll have that piece on the 1st of October.
Right, and nobody, and you know, if there's some anxiety that, you know, somebody here's gonna argue for us keeping $15 million in the bank, I'm not here to argue for that.
No,
Okay, if that's a
it's not my
question.
money, so I don't have any anxiety over it. I just want to do the right thing. I want to do the right thing. And
You sounded like there might be some anxiety that there was gonna be an argument over it. I don't think there
I never
is.
have any anxiety. I'm retired. I just try to do the right thing.
That's a different word.
How about
Concern.
Julie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think philosophically, I'm aligned with nearly everything Leanne just said, and I think we're actually quite close as I listen to all of the comments. Certainly, I would regard the 25% that it takes to get the state's best rating as a good floor or bottom of the range or target, however you want to put it. From what I'm hearing about in the historical overview that John so helpfully gave, we typically don't have a lot that causes us to want to dip into that reserve. And I think we take that into account when establishing a range, which I think should be fairly low. And not much over the 25%. In terms of capital outlay, I think that's something that belongs in the budget. I have heard Christine explain on many occasions, I think it's a very good point, that to the extent you want to engage in some large expansion or some large, building a new school or something like that, that is an appropriate time to go to the community with a referendum and make sure you have approval for that. And I think that's the right check and balance to keep in place. I think the fund policy should reflect that really what we're setting aside money for unforeseen contingencies, not for grand plans and not for, not over budgeting for rainy days that we have no reasonable expectation of ever coming. So.
When we finally get our fund balance down to the point where we are comfortable at whatever that final number is. But to Leanne's point, I like the idea of being very planful in our use of the money we do have.
It is, though, let's say one other thing, really important, because we've been using the 40% number as a refunding number. The 5.4 million that we're talking about to refund the bonds for defeasance purposes was used it's 40% of our existing fund balance. That's where that number came from.
You're bringing us down to a 60%
Right.
level.
Right.
So if 60% is too high, for example, and we think 50% or 40%, we may want to think about using more of that money to refund bonds and save even more. I'm not sure how that would work out, but it is an option that we ought to consider.
There's an alignment of things that need to come together.
Right.
All as a result of this.
Right, I think it's a very well taken point. I think our goal needs to be to stabilize tax rates over time, and doing so, one good way to do so is to refund or to use more of the fund balance for that refunding.
I wanted to add a couple points, just my personal philosophical perspective on the fund balance policy. You're going to see mine are more logistical in nature, but that's just who I am. I've already talked about how I'm a proponent of having a range spelled out. But I think we can work with a variety of different numbers. My biggest concern is the language in the policy that surrounds it, that safeguards it, that protects us going into the future. One of the things I want to make sure is in this fund balance policy is a very specific definition of what are we talking about, what is the fund balance, and how is it defined mathematically. I want to see a written plan, a requirement for a written plan in the fund balance policy that should we fall below or above that range or target number, that it requires a plan, a written plan produced in X amount of time that shows how we're going to return to whatever that requirement is. I would like to see, going forward in all of our future budgets, a narrative that gives explicit written explanations of how it's shaped to maintain the requirements set forth in the fund balance policy. I'd like to see a narrative that when we get when we start talking levies, that does the same thing, that gives an explicit written explanation of how it's shaped to maintain whatever requirements we've set forth in our fund balance policy. I'd like us to give consideration to fund balance policy by fund. State accounting is by fund, by definition. And whatever that number is, it's the biggest proportion of all our dollars are in our education fund. So at minimum, I think we need to have some explicit language in our fund balance policy about our education fund, because that is the granddaddy of the funds. And wherever that goes, so goes the district. I think that's my points. But I like everything I'm hearing. I think we're all very close philosophically. And I think this is going to turn out to be great once we kind of merge and get some information on, we pull out our crystal balls and dream up the perfect storm.
What is fund balance? What would we use it for? What could be the worst storm, perfect storm? That's what I'm hearing you say.
I think
You
that's
need
a big-
before you talk about that.
Because I think John makes a good point on, looking at history, that had that prior board had a fund balance of 25%, it would have been a non-issue, at least at the time. Going forward, what they've done going forward, we don't know, but I'm not sure I'm even ready to talk about what my gut says on a percentage level, but I would like to learn a lot more before we.
So what's the next step?
Well, I think that Jane and I took notes on what all of you would like. So we'll see if we can put together some of the things that you're looking for. You obviously need to talk to BLDD because several of you expressed being planful as far as capital projects. So you need that piece before you can set a fund balance policy.
Because we have 40 to 60% of the existing fund that we need to figure out how to
Use.
use effectively.
I think that, John, you wanted some numbers for things, and I wrote some specifics on here to see if we can get those. And then I think Leanne's point, which I think I heard from a couple of you, was the fund balance policy, but also what we're gonna do now with our fund balance. But then you went into a little bit more on the defeasance, so I think you're all kind of in agreement. You just need to have more of a discussion on that.
And one of the things we talked about with Liz when she was here was using a combination of defeasance and abatement so that we leveled that tax rate off over the next couple of years. This may give us a little more flexibility.
Yeah, because we're going to kind of have that little spike.
Right.
We call it a soft landing
Right.
to try to alleviate that for the taxpayers.
I would also request that we do officially ask BLDD to present to us, because I think, and if we get that presentation in advance, we'll have some time, because that's really meaningful to me, and I think to most of us here to.
And they would prefer to present it rather than just send it,
Yeah.
Good.
leave us to our own
Good, and
devices.
as long as we have some time ahead to digest it and come up with some good questions, that'd be wonderful.
So what day of the week is October 1st?
That's October 7th, isn't it?
Yeah, but if we get the report
Okay.
October 7th, I'm back
7th is a
happy.
Monday, I think.
7th on Monday.
The 1st is a Tuesday,
That'd be great.
and that's when we're gonna get it.
We may have it a day or two before, but I just told them no later than October.
So we'll get it out to you no later than October 2nd for the October 7th meeting.
That sounds good.
You know, I have a question. I'm not even sure if I can word this well, but we're making a number of changes at one time. So in regards to the budget, we're talking about budgeting with no contingency in it. And we haven't talked about levy yet, but I'm sort of expecting that we're going to talk about levying to the budget and not in excess of that because we don't want to accumulate more reserves. And yet when we talk about what we have in the budget with no contingency plan, we say, well, it really doesn't matter if you go over because you can go back and just amend your budget and you dip into reserves to take that out.
So there's an iteration that has to go back and forth.
Well, they're all kind of tied together. And the other concern I have, and this is, you know, math beyond my capability really, but when we we change our levy, then we are limited by PTEL and how much we can do in the future. So I'm just noticing that this really restricts our flexibility, and I want us to just be thoughtful about that because I think it's going to be a pretty big change, right?
I respect that approach, but let's keep magnitude in mind here. You know, we're talking about 15 million, and with the contingencies that we remove are $500,000. So even if we put all the contingencies back, roughly $500,000, right, Jane?
375.
375,000. So, you know, there's a big spread between 15 million and 375. I think we should be mindful, no question, I agree with that. But I think we need to continue to keep magnitude in our back of our minds.
To your point, I made the point, and I hope maybe I'll reiterate it. I would like to see some type of feedback loop between the budget and levy process and the fund balance policy, that there needs to be discussion or written narrative or written plans every time we get a budget proposal of how this impacts the fund balance projected out going forward, and if it goes above or below, if it projects a change, how are we going to bring it back to that where we want it? Same with levying. I don't think we can do any of these in isolation.
Yeah, I like one other thing. I'm not ready to give in on the levy because we may decide, for example, that we do want to levy to the max to cover potential capital expenses that we haven't budgeted for in the past.
Yes.
Okay, and the levy, this levy that
Correct.
you're going to approve this December is probably going to be the most important levy the board ever adopts because of
It's the third year, right?
because
Don't
last
put any
year we
pressure on
lowered it
us.
so drastically and we're, you know, to intentionally spend down some reserves. So what we do with this levy is going to affect all future levies.
Right.
We can reach back to 2011 levy for our PTEL base to increase this levy. But if we levy even $1 more than we did in 2012, 2013 is your new base. Okay, you can't keep reaching back to the higher ones.
Right.
You can do that. We can do that now because 12 is less than 11. But if 13 is more than 12, no matter what it is, that's your new base.
Good to know.
Which,
Got
since we abated in 12,
Right.
it's
The
gonna be
debt
higher.
service doesn't count.
So the
The
only
debt
way,
service
Debt
is
service
not a part of
because it's a
PTEL.
separate levy.
So yeah,
Okay.
so that's
the only way
okay.
to keep reaching back to 11 is to levy
Less.
less
A dollar less.
13 than we did in 12.
Correct.
A dollar.
So this is a very, very important levy.
See?
It'll affect your
So
future
we certainly don't want to do
planning.
just a dollar more.
No.
Then you've got that very much reduced
Yeah.
levy, which is, you know,
Set
really
up-
isn't
set up your
covering
spreadsheet to-
expenses.
I
To
see.
show warnings if you go a dollar over.
Yeah.
So-
Right.
so
right.
that-
I got it.
It's going to be a very thoughtful.
Yeah.
And so when we come to
Planning.
doing this levy conversation this year, then are we going to be prepared in terms of having had the strategic plan data that's going to be talking about what the capital stuff looks like in the future? Or are we going to do it blind again? Guess.
I would prefer you
Like
don't do it
last
blind.
time. Well, I mean, it was
The
kind of
fi-
blind last time.
Well, the strategic, when you look at your board planning calendar, the
Yes.
strategic plan is being presented at the September 24th board meeting.
Also, I think that, I feel pretty comfortable that BLOD outlined our capital needs, so we know what those are.
Well, it outlined, though, what they could see just looking at the bricks. And it didn't talk about things like improving security,
That-
making a handicap accessible entrance, or any kind of obsolescence of the building for the purposes that you have today that might not have been the same 40 years ago.
Educational adequacy.
Okay, that's better.
And that's coming.
Yes, correct.
Right. So I'm just saying, and you know, maybe we'll all be very happy to find out that the dollar figure doesn't really change. I'm certainly not expecting it to be like, you know, 15 million or to impact our ability to do this, you know, what we talked about, yeah, the defeasance. But I just want to be aware of it.
Rich, like you're jumping.
I just want to get back to exactly what we all think ought to be in the fund balance policy as far as specifics. Is it strictly for, you know, as we say here, that it's, you know, for unforeseen events and unexpected expenses? Is it also for whatever the state has as our minimum requirements? You know, I just feel like we're bouncing around and we don't have it defined what our fund balance is, the purpose is.
Well, that's what we're gonna define.
Exactly, yeah.
But it sounds like we're all pretty much coming up with a very similar list, right?
Yeah.
We want the state rating.
Could we kind of review and see where we are
Do
then?
you want me to read through all your comments?
No. No,
Well,
but can we just make a list
I want
of
to
what?
distill them down and,
But Jean, instead of going through all the comments, I think what we're trying to get here is just the list of what we think needs to be in that fund balance. Like, what's the purpose
First
of it?
draft of
The
language.
purpose of it would be that we keep enough money on hand to meet the state requirement for a positive rating from the state, to have enough on hand that if we need to issue a bond or however you word that,
Bond ratings.
bond rating is good, to cover unforeseen expenses,
Stabilized taxes.
stabilize taxes, and then I also think that policy needs to say what we would do.
And how we would manage it, I hope. That's
If,
kind
you
of
know,
what's
okay, so you fall below your floor, what's
What's next?
you create a plan or
How are
something.
you going to use your budget levy to bring it back to that point?
Not what you were looking for.
The only other thing that you did, that I have in my notes is the definition, to make sure that
Oh,
we're
right.
comparing the apples to apples.
But that's not what you meant, Rich?
I don't know, it just seems like we're floating around here and we're not,
Well, we were out here, now we're here. We're still floating, but I think we're narrowing in on it, you know.
So I feel pretty comfortable with where we've landed. I mean, there are questions that need to be addressed. I think we hopefully have a better understanding of what, I mean, I wish I could go back 30 years and see what sorts of things have occurred that might come up unexpectedly. I can't do that. But Jane, you've been around a long time, and Gene, you've been around a long time.
You've been around the block.
Yeah, I mean, you must know what sorts of things we need to
Careful
In
when
the
you word
friendliest
that.
way you can
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah, not all that.
We highly value your experience. And both of your experience, highly value your
You know,
experience.
you should recognize what sorts of things we need to be aware of. I'm a new board member, I can't come up with those items, but the two of you should. And,
We can put, I'd say one of the bigger ones is exactly what happened before. A big lawsuit of some kind.
right, but you're talking about a very small number. And so let's keep
Well-
that too.
But percentage,
It's a 200,000, even let's say $1 million.
Those greedy lawyers, they're a lot different these days than they used to be.
Do we have insurance for that?
we do have liability insurance. It would depend on, I know here it hasn't happened, but in Palatine, there are different cases I would run by Hodges and they'd say, you need to refer this one to your liability carrier.
Okay.
So it just, you kind of work to make that
That may be
decision.
something we need to know as well. What is our liability coverage? Because in the case, when I mentioned earlier that they had this unbudgeted health insurance claim, it turned out that it was reimbursed a year or two later through health insurance. It just didn't come into play in that year's particular budget.
I remember researching that issue, and that was a bad deal and a bad co-op that we got out of.
But anyway, I think we should understand our liability, because if we have liability to cover some of these unforeseen circumstances that we would use the reserve for.
right.
Sometimes though you do, like if you had an unforeseen circumstance that really dented your budget and you didn't get the reimbursement for 3 years and you still needed to make payroll, so you need to have enough money to transition you through those
Yeah,
tough
and
times.
25% of 14 million is about $5 million. So I mean, that's quite a big number to cover unforeseen circumstances. Even
I don't want you to get the sense that you keep coming back to the 25. I'm not arguing against it, I'm just discussing.
Other than the 1 year of the perfect storm, how many other times have they had to
I
dip
couldn't
into
find
it?
anything. They never had a reserve. I mean, the fact is, they were gonna take it from 564
That's
to
scary.
100,000. They had a very conservative, according to, and any of you can call Lisa, she'd be glad to talk to you, but according to her, she went back, she told me she went back and read a lot of old minutes. She couldn't find a case where they had a reserve at all, or much of a reserve.
Did they have the requirements for financial profile score that, I think, in those days? Did they have that?
That came about,
Early 2000s sometime.
it's been in my career, yeah.
It's been in mine since I've been back at
Yeah, I
work,
want to
so
say,
early
So
2000s.
they weren't dealing with that.
Just out of curiosity, what happens if you don't meet the state's, if you don't get 5 stars from the state?
4 stars.
4
Well,
stars.
the 5, that's AYP right now, so the financial recognition is not stars yet. So if you're a financial warning, you want to talk to us, talk a little bit about.
well, I've never been in financial warning, but I think now you have to establish a plan. I think you have to
Right.
file a plan with them, and if you're on it for 3 years, that's when they start looking at an oversight panel to come in and take over the district.
Kind of like North Chicago.
We should
Yes,
be thoughtful
exactly.
enough, as Mark said earlier, constructing this policy where that never happens. I mean, we should be looking forward, anticipating, planning, so that we never get to that point at all. And if we have, I don't know what the number would be, but if 25% is the minimum, but we go to 40%, we should really be in good shape.
And I will say that because we are a district that is over 90% property tax driven revenue, it is a better place to be than the vast majority of districts who are dependent on state funding.
Right.
I would recommend they have a very good fund
Right.
reserve because the state at any time isn't going to pony up their fair share. And
Totally-
that breaks them.
Totally different
It
situation.
is a totally different situation. So as much as I have advocated for higher fund balances, it is different in a district that's property tax-based revenue. That is a much more stable.
Unless the
revenue.
state decides to change our ability to levy, which occasionally comes up.
Well,
as a
and which happens
conversation.
Like every session.
Veto. Exactly.
That would have a big impact.
But we went through a major recession from 2007 through the president. That didn't seem to affect our ability to set a tax rate.
I think the other thing that we can make a list, which I have a running list going. The other thing that they're talking about, which changes daily, is the shift in pension costs to the state, to the districts. So we'll just make a perfect storm scenario.
I
and
mean,
add up the
What,
expenses.
wasn't
it-
that
is
like
it too-
$350,000?
It depends on what scenario. Every day the scenario changes.
is it too far-fetched to say, I sent an article to Jean, I think she forwarded it to people, about communities near Detroit were having trouble issuing bonds because nobody wants to touch anything close to there. And our state is probably, I don't know, maybe in the
Not a
same
role
kind of
model.
condition as, okay. I mean, is it too far-fetched to consider that as one of our,
Then we could get dragged down by the
Issues.
state's problems.
well, it could impact our ability to do a bond. If Illinois went bankrupt, or, I mean, they're,
Is that a question for a bond expert?
I don't, I mean, we could also get hit by a tsunami. I mean, there's a lot of things that would happen that you need to think about, but I don't, Jane, you probably have a better, I mean, we're considered, I think we're valued based on first the district and its stability, and then the village and its stability. I don't think the state really.
Well, and I don't know how Michigan funds schools.
okay.
I don't know how their school
I
funding
think this was,
works
I
out.
don't even think this was schools, they just said that
Okay.
municipalities, anything near Detroit, they couldn't
It's
issue
like a black
bonds.
hole right there.
Yeah, and I don't even know that it was like that it was with good reason, it's just what happened.
I think because of the way the state of Illinois, the 8 billion governmental entities that we have, taxing bodies that we have, which is high compared to most states.
Very.
The school districts are kind of their own independent little government. That works in our benefit, even though we are in the state of Illinois.
Okay.
I took notes on everything, so we'll try to put some of this together. We'll book BLDD. I'll actually see if we can get some of this together for the September 24th meeting.
Okay.
So you can keep being given the information and some opportunities for discussion.
Does anybody else have any other issues?
Does everyone want a copy of that stuff I have?
I think we-
I'm,
I want to just understand what that means.
Take your word for it.
Because I don't have this much, but you know,
It's
an
thick.
inch.
If you boil it down to their summary questions, you're still talking an inch of paper.
It's a lot of paper.
I mean,
would
is there
email
more
it
we
to you,
need to
though.
know than what you said?
It's interesting reading, but I don't think so. I mean, it's,
Okay.
Why don't we
I
make
mean,
it
it might be
available?
interesting for the district to have copies of that stuff
Yeah, John's
because
gonna get.
previous
I'm
previous
gonna get
administrations haven't left us with
I'm
documentation.
gonna get Jean, if she can make copies, then it'll be available to the district clerk.
And if you want it, just, if you change your mind, you wake up in the middle of the night and say, gee, I wish I would have asked for that, just send me an email.
Okay, are we ready to move past the fund balance policy conversation for tonight?
Yes.
Are there other issues, concerns, questions that people have about anything we've talked about or things that need to come up that haven't come up?
I have one quick thing. I was approached by some parents in the community who were concerned about people making turns on the corner of Green Bay and 176, where there's a crossing guard and there are signs posted that say no right turn on red when there are pedestrians present. One of our crossing guards was actually hit by a car, was that 2 years ago? Year and a half to 2 years ago. And so they went to the police department and asked for help with that, and hopefully that'll, get resolved. But I wanted to bring it here. I think the school board needs to be aware of it. I don't know if there's something we should do to try and get the right turn on red stopped at that corner, because I have to tell you, I drove through there the next day, and there were a couple people who right turned on red in front of pedestrians, and they're little kids.
I would share one of the other possibilities after I thought that whole thing through is anybody that's interested, we could always attend a village meeting and share concerns there. We used to do that in my other
Well,
district.
the sign says no turn on red when pedestrians are present, so I think it's a police issue, really. I mean, when I come up to that thing, I really am very, especially in the morning, it's between 7:45 and 8 is when you're talking. I've seen the same thing happen. So
On Green Bay
maybe
Road
we-
near Deer Path, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, they have specific times, no turn on red from X to Y period, or maybe it's always, I don't know, maybe it's changed, but maybe that's more explicit, but I guess I'm with John, I think it's probably a police issue, and if there isn't sufficient policing, then maybe we need to come back to it, make a specific recommendation to the police of a change, or
I know
more
when I was,
signage, or.
when I was notified, I contacted the police and the village. And there was some police out there for a couple days,
A
so.
couple of.
We'll hope it continues. I just want to make the rest of the board aware of that complaint.
Any other issues, questions, comments? We now go to item 5, which is public comment. If anybody would like to address the board, Kate, this is specifically aimed at you since you're the only one here. No? Okay. Since nobody is here to address the board, we'll move on. And can I have a motion to adjourn?
Hold on.
Wait.
No, you can't.
At 9:13 and a half.
Okay, who did the motion? Now you can have it.
Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Susan made the motion. I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It's unanimous. We are adjourned. Thank you.